Marxism and the Oppression of Women. Section: Critics and Criticisms. As we have noted, Marxism and the Oppression of Women created barely a stir in feminist and Marxist circles upon its publication. The sole scholarly response of any significance was written by Joanna Brenner, author of one of the most important and social feminist works of the 2000s. Footnote: Brenner, 2000. As further evidence of the scholarly neglect of Vogel's book, we note that it does not garner a mention in the impressive survey of historical materialist work on gender relations provided in Huag, 2005. End footnote. For Brenner, Vogel's book is remarkable as a contribution to radical historiography, particularly in its retrieval of the Marxist tradition on the woman question, and for situating it within the political context of the early socialist movement. Vogel, she suggests, extends our understanding of the roots of dual systems theory, tracing it to classics by Engels and Bebel, while identifying an alternate, quote, social reproduction approach derived from Marx's mature works. Brenner is less impressed, however, by Vogel's theoretical innovations, suggesting that her social reproduction framework fails to adequately consider the conflicts of interest between men and women, especially with respect to the active role men play in instituting and maintaining gender oppression. As a result, she argues, Vogel passes over key socialist feminist questions about why men, almost universally, exercise power over women within the family system. Footnote: Brenner rightly criticizes Vogel for her overly narrow review of the socialist tradition on the woman question, noting that she fails to engage with the work of either the anarchist Emma Goldman or the Bolshevik Alexandra Kollontai. End footnote. Intriguingly, Brenner attributes this failure to the high level of abstraction and generality of Vogel's analysis. An adequate unitary theory, she insists, would have to specify at least how class structure sets the limits within which subordinate classes organize families and households, and how these terms are set in such a way as to encourage male-dominated family systems. Such a project, she continues, involves looking beyond the material basis of society to the ideological and political structures that comprise the gender hierarchy. Lacking such an account, Vogel offers only a preliminary stage of social reproduction theory. Brenner's comments here are instructive for the degree to which they articulate the very problem Vogel has set out to solve: the establishment of a theoretically indispensable first-level analysis of capital, gender, and social reproduction that will make a unitary theory, as opposed to a dualist or a purely descriptive account, possible. Brenner is indeed correct that Vogel does not try to theorize the exercise of male power within the household per se, or to provide an historical account of its development. Instead, her interest is in analyzing what it is about the fundamental relations of capitalism that seem to require a family system based upon a male-dominated gender order. As she puts it, it is the responsibility for the domestic labor necessary to capitalist social reproduction, and not the sex division of labor or the family per se, that materially underpins the perpetuation of women's oppression and inequality in capitalist society. End quote. Unlike so much feminist thought, especially after the linguistic turn in social theory, she seeks to decipher the socio-material foundations for a household system based on female oppression. To this end, she explores the way in which specifically capitalist dynamics establish definite limits on the possible range of institutions and practices of social reproduction. In identifying capital's contradictory need to exploit and renew labor power, in considering this in light of the necessarily differentiated relationship of men and women, or male-sexed and female-sexed bodies, to the procreative and nursing aspects of those practices, Vogel identifies the socio-material dynamic of the capitalist system that tends to reproduce patriarchal family forms, as it persistently has across the spaces and times of world capitalism. Of course, here we are dealing with a tendency, not an iron law. The fact that social reproduction is, and must be, played out through embodied individuals enmeshed in the imperatives of capitalism, does not mean that any and all family forms are functionally determined. Cultural traditions and social struggles will also shape the range of available household arrangements. But by identifying the key problem of the necessity under capitalism for a social site that biologically and socially reproduces labor power, Vogel's analysis allows us to understand why capitalist societies, notwithstanding a wide array of diverse histories, have repeatedly reproduced male-dominated family forms. Similarly, it also offers a way of understanding why domestic forms can change in significant ways, as with the growing legal recognition and acceptance of same-sex marriages and households, as well as single-mother or single-father-headed households, without women's oppression being eliminated. For however much ruling classes have resisted the relaxation of gender norms and sexual mores, these changes have not inherently undermined the gendering of fundamental responsibilities for birthing, nurturing, and raising of young children. In these ways, Vogel does indeed set the preliminary stage for a social reproduction theory that logically connects women's oppression to essential features of the capitalist mode of production. Footnote. It is unfortunate that Vogel later appropriated Althusser's hyper-extracted notion of theory, uncontaminated by the empirical, in order to explain her theoretical procedure in Marxism and the Oppression of Women. See Vogel 2000. In our view, it would be greatly more productive to understand Vogel's procedure as establishing the conditions of possibility of family forms and gender order in a capitalist society. End footnote. Rather than a weakness in her work, this is, as we have argued above, a singular accomplishment of Marxism and the Oppression of Women. By working within the conceptual architecture of capital, Vogel not only opens up a most fruitful line of historical materialist enquiry, she also overcomes some considerable weaknesses of earlier socialist feminism. In particular, as we have seen, she lucidly rebuts the flawed claim that unpaid labor in the home produces both value and surplus value. At the same time, however, Vogel falls into the trap of arguing that domestic labor is a component of necessary labor, in the sense in which Marx used the term in Capital. She clearly erred here, as she later acknowledged in the 2000 article from Science and Society that is reprinted as an appendix to this book. Vogel was, of course, right that the labor of producing and reproducing current and future generations of wage laborers is socially necessary to capital. But the term necessary labor has a much more restricted meaning for Marx in his theory of surplus value. It refers to the labor that comprises a necessary cost for capital, the labor that must be paid in wages out of capital's funds. Footnote. Of course, as we have seen, these wages must be adequate to help sustain the production of the next generation of laborers. But the necessary cost for capital is the direct payment of the laborers who engage in the immediate process of production. End footnote. This is why Marx refers to wages as variable capital. There is much more unwaged work, labor that does not have to be paid for by capital, that is necessary to the reproduction of a capitalist society. And capital is certainly greatly aided by the fact that children are birthed, nursed, nourished, loved, and educated in kin-based units, just as adults are physically, psychically, and socially reproduced there. But individual capitals here benefit from social practices that do not form any of their necessary costs. Footnote. Of course, some of these costs might be claimed by the state by way of taxes on profits. We abstract from that issue here, as they do not affect the argument about the rate of surplus value. End footnote. There is thus no rate of surplus value here, both because these practices are not commodified, they produce use values, but not values, and because there is no direct cost structure for the capital involved. Vogel's later correction of this point is an important clarification that readers should bear in mind when reading her texts. More than this, It is a reminder of the critical scientific spirit that informs Marxism and the Oppression of Women, and that makes it a work capable of renewal, extension, and development. End of section.